Please be seated. The sitting is open. For reasons duly made known to me, Judges Yusuf and Gomez Robledo are unable to sit with us today. The court meets this morning to hear the second round of oral argument of the Republic of Azerbaijan on the preliminary objections raised by the respondent in the case concerning application of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Azerbaijan versus Armenia. I shall now give the floor to Mr. Bonlo. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Mr. President, members of the Court, Armenia's request was spelled out in its initial formulation in paragraph 143 of its preliminary objections, and in its current formulation it was set out in the final submissions of its agent on Wednesday afternoon. The short answer to Armenia's case is that both parties are agreed that there is no objection on grounds either of jurisdiction ratione temporis or of admissibility to Azerbaijan's claims concerning acts and omissions that had not been completed by September 1996. There is no dispute that Azerbaijan has such post-1996 claims. Armenia addressed some of them on Wednesday. The claims concerning the laying of landmines and booby traps during the 2020s, the failure to act against hate speech, the obstruction of the return of Azerbaijanis and the looting and destruction of cultural artifacts, which indisputably occurred after 1996. The dispossession of property throughout the years of the occupation, which international courts have consistently treated as a continuing wrong, is another obvious example. Therefore, this case must go ahead to a hearing on the merits. The only question is whether some aspects of Azerbaijan's claims are excluded. Azerbaijan agrees that the court can and should make determinations now concerning first its jurisdiction over Azerbaijan's case ratione materiae, insofar as it relates to landmines, booby traps and environmental harm, and second, the scope of its jurisdiction ratione temporis, that is, on the question whether in this case Armenia can in principle bear responsibility for any conduct completed after 23 July 1993 or only for conduct completed after 15 September 1996. These matters have a preliminary character that can be decided now, although their impact on Azerbaijan's case is at most marginal. Those determinations will help the parties focus their forthcoming written pleadings. The effect of the answers to these questions on Azerbaijan's claims is something to be addressed in the counter-memorial and subsequent written pleadings and at the hearing on the merits. But there is no doubt that Azerbaijan's third case will go ahead. Armenia has repeatedly mischaracterized Azerbaijan's case, and each time Azerbaijan explains what its case actually is, in the face of Armenia's misunderstanding, Armenia complains that Azerbaijan is changing its case. In both rounds of its submissions this week, Armenia tried to reformulate Azerbaijan's third complaint in an attempt to bolster its ratione materiae and ratione temporis objections. Armenia tried to convince you that Azerbaijan has failed to demonstrate that Armenia's landmines, booby traps, and environmental destruction formed part of a campaign of ethnic cleansing and cultural eradication. But these are issues for the merits. Indeed, watching Armenia's slide presentation on Wednesday with its multiplicity of maps and colourful overlays, it was hard to believe that this is a hearing on preliminary objections rather than on the merits. Azerbaijan has not changed its case. Azerbaijan's case has always centred upon Armenia's 30-year campaign of ethnic cleansing and cultural erasure, including both the forcible and collective expulsion and displacement of Azerbaijanis and the prevention of their return. Azerbaijan has always presented Armenia's deployment of landmines and booby traps and its destruction and pillage of the environment and resources of the formerly occupied areas as being among the many elements of the 30-year campaign. This was made perfectly clear in Azerbaijan's letter of 8th December 2020, informing Armenia of its third complaint, in Azerbaijan's application to the court in September 2021, in Azerbaijan's memorial in January 2023, and in its submissions this week. Azerbaijan has set out, 1, the facts on which it relies, and 2, the provisions of the CERD that it says are violated by those facts. As written and oral submissions have been exchanged, it has refined or clarified its case. That is what rounds of submissions and phases of proceedings are for, the clarification of the precise legal questions on which the parties disagree. But the allegation that sits at the heart of Azerbaijan's third complaint has not changed. This Armenia has long known, despite its claim that these proceedings took it completely by surprise, even as it prepared its own third claim against Azerbaijan. And Professor Talman will say more on that shortly. So both parties are agreed that this case will go forward to a merits hearing, and the response by Azerbaijan could stop at this point. But Armenia made a number of further points to which it's convenient to respond at this stage. I shall address the ratione temporis objection. Professor Talman will then address the objections to admissibility. The legal and factual aspects of Armenia's objection relating to landmines and booby traps will be addressed by Mr. Wordsworth and Mr. Oki, respectively. And Professor Boisson de Chazourne will address the ratione materiae objection concerning environmental harm. Mr. Martin repeated more than once that Armenia's assertion that the ethnic cleansing campaign had ended by 1994. It may become clearer at the merit stage why Armenia is so keen to exclude the First Karabakh War from the court's view, but 3 points can be made at this stage. First, a campaign of ethnic cleansing is not over and done with the minute the last resident is pushed over the border. It continues when steps are taken to prevent or otherwise frustrate the residents' return and to import and maintain new residents in their place. It continues as the occupying power makes former cities, towns and villages uninhabitable, or destroys the infrastructure or the cultural buildings and artifacts, or the environmental and natural resources that have sustained the community prior to its expulsion. Ethnic cleansing is not an act, it is a strategy, a policy, a campaign. And in this case, it continued after 1994 and after 1996 and up until recent months. Second, Azerbaijan's claim concerning a violation of the CERD by conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing no more precludes or extinguishes Azerbaijan's separate claims relating, for example, to the promotion of racial hatred and incitement to violence, or to the failure to provide protection and remedies against racially discriminating acts, than a claim concerning apartheid would extinguish claims concerning individual racially motivated murders. The ethnic cleansing claim stands alongside these other claims in this case. Third, it is indisputable that these other claims, such as deprivation of property, incitement of racial hatred, and the prevention of the return of displaced Azerbaijanis to the Karabakh region, continued for many years after 1994 or 1996, throughout the Armenian occupation and even beyond. And this is the key point. Whatever questions Armenia may raise around the margins, Azerbaijan's case is essentially about the fact that Armenia has been violating its CERD obligations on a continuing basis throughout the past 30 years or so. Armenia presented arguments as to what could and could not be part of a composite breach in this case. But it had very little to say about Azerbaijan's main point on jurisdiction, which relates to continuing breaches, and the fact that the breaches in this case continued long after even Armenia's preferred critical date of 1996. A detailed consideration of which specific aggregations of facts constitute composite breaches in the present case is a matter for the merits phase. So is the question of which specific conduct constitutes a continuing breach of the CERD. But what is important at this stage is that there is neither a basis nor even a request from Armenia for a ruling that composite and continuing claims extending beyond 1996 are outside the court's jurisdiction or inadmissible. Mr. Martin spent most of his time on Wednesday on his erga omnes argument, though it's of relatively minor importance to Azerbaijan's case because it only affects conduct completed between July 1993 and September 1996 and leaves continuing acts, including composite acts, unaffected. There is nonetheless a real legal question here. Armenia says that a state party, Azerbaijan, can only pursue a dispute settlement procedure in respect of conduct occurring after the CERD enters into force for it, regardless of how much earlier the respondent state was bound by the convention. Azerbaijan says that once the CERD enters into force for a state, one, it can pursue the procedure in respect of any question concerning the interpretation or application of the convention, regardless of when the underlying conduct occurred, but two, no state party can be held in breach of the CERD for any conduct completed before the convention entered into force for that party. It's a narrow and peripheral question which has no bearing on Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing claim and could only affect any isolated acts that were completed between July 1993 and September 1996, but it is at least a real question. You've heard the parties' submissions on the matter. Azerbaijan maintains that its understanding of the position fits with the ordinary meaning of the words of Article 22. And we note that even on Wednesday, Armenia didn't argue that the application of the rules on treaty interpretation in Article 31 of the Vienna Convention leads to any different conclusion. Armenia simply asserts that the drafters of the CERD could not have intended to establish a position contrary to that now advanced by Armenia, in which Azerbaijan cannot point to breaches of the CERD by Armenia between the dates of Armenia's ratification in 1993 and Azerbaijan's ratification in 1996. Though Armenia sees things differently, Azerbaijan sees nothing unfair or irrational or let alone absurd in a state that has accepted legal obligations being thenceforth expected to comply with them. And I should note two further points. First, in its application, Azerbaijan does not ask the court to say that Armenia breached Azerbaijan's rights, but rather that Armenia breached its obligations under the CERD. And the distinction is important. Second, Armenia seems to view the CERD as a network of bilateral contractual package deals between the state's parties. This is at odds with the plain language of CERD, whose obligations to eliminate racial discrimination are not expressed as or limited to inter partes obligations, but rather, as its preamble repeatedly emphasizes, apply to all human beings with a view to eliminating racial discrimination throughout the world in all its forms. And as we recalled on Tuesday, the court itself explained many years ago that in conventions of this kind, one cannot speak of individual advantages or disadvantages to states, or of the maintenance of a perfect contractual balance between rights and duties. Armenia surely cannot seriously suggest that its obligation to eliminate racial discrimination as from 23rd July 1993 applied only to the select nationals of those state parties who were also bound by the convention as at that date. For example, looking at Armenia's table of CERD ratifications, that Armenia remained free to discriminate against South Africans, but not Ethiopians, or against Americans, but not French nationals, or against Japanese, but not Chinese nationals. More fundamentally, the CERD is not all about us. Conventions such as the CERD are not only about states. They're designed for the protection of individuals. That is their purpose. And that is why the human rights instruments have, and emphasize the importance of having, collective enforcement mechanisms. Mr. Martin also referred to a 2005 resolution of the Institut de Droit International. Interesting as the work of the Institute always is, there are many loose threads here. For example, Article 2 refers to states to which the obligation is owed, not states to which the obligation was owed at the time of the act complained of. And Article 6 says that this is all without prejudice to the rights and remedies pertaining to a state which is specially affected by the breach of an obligation erga omnes, as Azerbaijan is obviously specially affected here. But because this argument is of such marginal importance and the Institute text seems to have left no discernible footprint on the sands of state practice, Azerbaijan leaves the matter there and invites the court to decide this question on the basis of the parties' respective submissions, insofar as it considers that it needs to decide it at all. That brings my submission on behalf of Azerbaijan to an end. I thank the Court for its attention and ask that you call Professor Talman to the lectern.
I thank Mr. von Loo for his statement. I now invite Mr. Stefan Talman to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Monsieur le Président, Madam Vice President, distinguished members of the Court. My task is once again to respond to Armenia's admissibility objection. The parties agree that a delay, if any, is only relevant if it is detrimental to the respondent. And it is only detrimental if the respondent could have a reasonable expectation that a claim would no longer be pursued. Armenia claims that it had a reasonable expectation that no claim would be brought by Azerbaijan with regard to Armenia's campaign of ethnic cleansing that allegedly took place only before 15 September 1996. I would invite you, members of the Court, to pause for a moment, take a step back, and ask yourself this question. How can a state forcibly seize a fifth of the territory of another state, kill some 23,000 of its nationals, cause some 3,900 of its nationals to go missing, ethnically cleanse a whole area, drive 1 million people from their homes, deprive them of their property, destroy their cultural heritage, loot their natural resources, and then stand up and claim with a straight face that it has a reasonable expectation that no claim would be brought against it. It cannot. But that is exactly what Armenia has been doing the last few days. Armenia bases its purported reasonable expectation on the fact that the latest letter to the UN, referred in the transcript of my speech on Tuesday, dates from the 25th of August 1997. However, these letters to the UN were only given as examples to show that from the 23rd of July 1993, when Armenia became a party to CERT, Azerbaijan had registered its grievances about Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign with the United Nations and asked for these grievances to be made known to the international community, including Armenia. Numerous other letters could be provided. If one searches the UN official document system for the terms Armenia, ethnic cleansing, and Karabakh, some 224 documents are shown for the period between July 1993 and September 2021. For example, in January 1999, Azerbaijan wrote to the Human Rights Commission that, I quote, as a result of the policy of the Republic of Armenia of aggression and ethnic cleansing against Azerbaijan, the rights and freedoms of 1 million Azerbaijanis continue to be gravely violated on a daily basis. In 2005, Azerbaijan intervened in the case of Chiragov and others versus Armenia before the European Court of Human Rights, submitting that there were continuing violations by Armenia of inter alia the prohibition on discrimination. Azerbaijan based the violation on the fact that Azerbaijani internally displaced persons were physically prevented from returning home through the deployment of Armenian military forces and landmines on the line of contact. And in 2007 and 2012, Azerbaijan submitted extensive reports to the United Nations on the international legal rights of the Azerbaijani internally displaced persons and the Republic of Armenia's responsibility. Armenia dismisses the letters and documents sent to the UN because they allegedly refer to ethnic cleansing which took place and was allegedly completed in 1994. Does this mean that claims with regard to ethnic cleansing can be made only during the time when the cleansing is actually underway? That cannot be correct. In any case, as Professor Lowe has shown, Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign was by no means completed in 1994. Armenia also tries to brush aside these constant reminders of its ethnic cleansing campaign by introducing the new admissibility requirement of a proper legal claim. In Armenia's view, a claim is only to be admissible if a legal claim has been presented to the respondent without delay. For such a proper legal claim, it is not enough that grievances are raised or that the factual situation is presented, nor even that these facts are described in legal terms as ethnic cleansing. No, such a proper legal claim must, according to Armenia, mention the third, formulate a specific request for remedies, and specifically invoke the international responsibility of the Republic of Armenia, and not just its leaders. This last point undoubtedly marks the height of legal sophistry in Armenia's argument. What more do you need to invoke the international responsibility of a state for ethnic cleansing than accuse its state organs of the act and ask for remedial action? In any case, there are numerous examples of Azerbaijan expressly accusing the Republic of Armenia of ethnic cleansing. While according to the court in Georgia versus Russia, raising grievances related to the subject matter of the third is sufficient for there to be a dispute under third, this does not suffice for Armenia's new requirement of a proper legal claim. Armenia, of course, did not tell the court when exactly such a proper legal claim should have been made in order to prevent a reasonable expectation that no claim would be brought. On 15 September 1996, on the 15th of September 2006, or at any other date. Such a proper legal claim was allegedly made in the Nauru case on 4 occasions. But all Nauru did was to state in general terms that it was Australia's responsibility to rehabilitate 1/3 of the island. No legal basis, no specific request. Armenia's new admissibility requirement has no basis in the court's jurisprudence or in the work of the ILC. It is not about whether or when a proper legal claim has been presented, but whether the respondent state could have reasonably expected that a claim would no longer be presented. Armenia could not have developed such a reasonable expectation. Armenia also submitted that there were no circumstances that would excuse Azerbaijan's delay in submitting its claim. The question of excuse, however, does not arise. As long as there was no reasonable expectation on the part of Armenia, Azerbaijan could bring its claim at any time. But as I stated on Tuesday, there were good reasons for Azerbaijan to wait with the submission of its application until it could gather evidence in the territories that had been under Armenian occupation for more than 26 years. Armenia asserted that it was difficult to see why access to the territory to collect specific evidence was necessary. But it is precisely a campaign of ethnic cleansing, in contrast to the expulsion of a single Azerbaijani, that requires the collection and preservation of evidence in the ethnically cleansed area. It is the desecrated cemeteries, the booby-trapped private homes, the mines planted in the agricultural fields, the vandalized religious buildings, and the cut-down ancient monument trees that prove the campaign. That evidence is, of course, only available in the territory from which the local population was cleansed. Let me finally briefly turn to Armenia's argument that it was disadvantaged in mounting a defense to Azerbaijan's claims, despite having had control for over 26 years. Armenia must surely have collected evidence to defend itself before the European Court of Human Rights in cases concerning violations of the European Convention on Human Rights with regard to the First Karabakh War. Armenia's argument that it did not need to prepare its defense because it could reasonably expect that no claim would be made is purely self-serving. If it really thought that occupying and ethnically cleansing a fifth of the territory of Azerbaijan and proceeding to erase all signs of Azerbaijani culture in the area would not give rise to any claim, then this is entirely Armenia's fault and cannot prevent Azerbaijan from bringing a claim under cert. Members of the Court, I thank you for your kind attention. Mr. President, may I ask you to call on Mr. Wordsworth to respond to Armenia's second preliminary objection.
I thank Mr. Talman for his statement. I now invite Mr. Samuel Wordsworth to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, members of the Court, I have 4 short points to make in response to Armenia's misconceived objection ratione materiae to what it wishes still to portray as a discrete claim concerning landmines and booby traps. There is, by contrast, nothing to respond to on Armenia's curious argument that landmines and booby traps cannot fall within a third claim as they are not themselves capable of discrimination, and likewise its incorrect interpretation of Article 1.1 as a rigid 2-step test. This line of argument, it appears quite correctly, has been abandoned. First then, and by way of introduction, it is useful to recall the difference between the two parties' jurisdictional objections ratione materiae concerning military force. Azerbaijan objects to the assertion of jurisdiction over Armenia's claim concerning alleged killings and violence during the active hostilities phases of an armed conflict, because this is put forward by Armenia as a freestanding claim of cert. And Azerbaijan considers that alleged unlawful use of cluster bombs and indiscriminate shelling is, where presented as a freestanding claim, a matter for the rules of international humanitarian law. However, to the extent that Armenia wishes to rely on evidence of the use of cluster bombs and indiscriminate shelling as part of the evidence to support its separate and broader claim of breach of cert through an alleged practice of ethnic cleansing, Azerbaijan has made no objection. It considers that it would have no basis for doing so. It is up to Armenia to put forward the evidence it wishes to support a claim concerning a practice of ethnic cleansing, and all agree that such a claim is capable of engaging cert. Precisely the same applies to Azerbaijan's claim concerning Armenia's breach of cert through its campaign of ethnic cleansing. It is up to Azerbaijan to put forward the evidence it wishes to support its claim, which includes evidence of the pursuit of this campaign through military means, including through the planting of landmines and booby traps to prevent the return of ethnic Azerbaijanis to the areas unlawfully occupied by the former illegal regime. This should be the end of the matter. But because of the obvious force of this point, Armenia seeks to recharacterize Azerbaijan's reliance on conduct and evidence with respect to landmines and booby traps as a freestanding claim, despite the fact that no such claim has been made. This leads me to my second point. The court has correctly noted in two separate orders that, as to Armenia's alleged conduct concerning landmines and booby traps, Azerbaijan claims that this conduct is part of a long-standing campaign of ethnic cleansing. Armenia's response is to suggest that you should ignore your own past orders, although the characterization in those orders is also the only one that could be available from the wording of the submissions in Azerbaijan's memorial. The suggested basis for the court ignoring its past characterization is a misapplication of the long-standing jurisprudence on real nature of the dispute, through which the court seeks to determine on an objective basis the subject matter of the dispute between the parties, by isolating the real issue in the case and identifying the object of the claim. But there is no issue here as to any of this. As correctly identified by the court, the claim is of a campaign of ethnic cleansing, with the laying of landmines and booby traps being conduct presented as part of the evidence of that campaign. Armenia does not suggest that there is no genuine ethnic cleansing claim before you, and it would be absurd to suggest that the real issue in the case is not ethnic cleansing at all, but rather some discrete but disguised claim confined to landmines and booby traps. I would also add that it is simply incorrect for Mr. Salanidis to assert that Azerbaijan, quote, did not address the abundance of evidence that I pointed to on Monday. Armenia is simply electing to ignore what we said in response on Tuesday, alongside the various references that we pointed the court to. Finally, on this point, there was a brief but baffling reference to certain irrelevant lines of jurisprudence concerning the submissions of disputing parties. Reference was made to the court's past cases concerning its power to exclude from a party's submissions contentions which are not indications of what the party is asking the court to decide, but are rather reasons advanced why the court should decide in the sense contended for by that party. But it is Armenia, not Azerbaijan, that is, quite bizarrely, seeking to include within Azerbaijan's submissions what are indeed reasons advanced why the court should decide in the sense contended for by Azerbaijan. Reference was also made to the ICAO Council case and the situation where a respondent state seeks to cast the submissions in its defence in such a way as to alter the nature of the dispute. To recall the rather obvious point that Azerbaijan is the claimant, not the respondent, so there is no question of the court being asked to characterise a claim by looking at submissions made in a defence. My third point concerns Armenia's misplaced reliance on the court's rejection of certain of the claims made in certain Iranian assets and the Diallo case. In the former, Iran had a number of freestanding claims of breach of the Treaty of Amity, expressly concerning the failure to accord sovereign immunity to Iran and Iranian companies. The court rejected those claims when it held that the treaty did not offer protection with respect to sovereign immunity. In Diallo, likewise, Guinea made a number of claims, including an express claim with respect to deprivation of the rights of Mr. Diallo as shareholder, and the court accepted that this claim was admissible. All the court is doing in such cases to identify, by reference to the claims actually made by the claimants, which claims are within jurisdiction and admissible and which are not. Armenia has not pointed to and cannot point to any case where the court has sought to strip out from a claim that is accepted to be within its jurisdiction through, I guess, some form of unknown power of strikeout, an element of evidence, an allegation of fact that a claimant considers relevant to the claim that it has in fact made. My final point concerns Armenia's continued reliance on the court's past orders in this case concerning plausibility. Mr. Salonides sought to draw out a distinction in the different phases of the Ukraine and Russia ICS-FT case between statements of the court concerning the plausibility of rights and the plausibility of claims. If there is a relevant distinction, it is not one that assists Armenia. The point, if we understood it correctly, is that the court finds, if the court finds that there are no plausible rights at the provisional measures phase, it should generally not be accepting jurisdiction ratione materiae over claims based on those rights. But that is precisely what the court did in the Ukraine and Russia case, and on the express basis that an assessment of plausibility of claims was generally inappropriate at the jurisdictional stage. Notably, it was also asserted that the court has already twice found that the alleged rights asserted by Azerbaijan with respect to landmines and booby traps are not plausible. There was again no attempt to look at what the orders of December 2021 and February 2023 actually say, or to address our point that there the court was focused specifically on the plausibility of obligations with respect to the interim remedies then being sought by Azerbaijan. As we explained on Tuesday, and as was not challenged, the court expressly recognised in both orders that a policy of driving persons of a certain national or ethnic origin from a particular area, as well as preventing their return thereto, can implicate rights under CERD, and that such a policy can be effected through a variety of military means. So the existence of potential rights was expressly recognised. What the court did not accept was that the CERD plausibly imposed obligations on Armenia to provide assistance with demining and the like. And that concerns the plausibility of the interim remedies then being sought by Azerbaijan. The question of whether rights are engaged under a treaty and the remedies that might then follow in a case of breach are entirely separate matters. As to Armenia's campaign of ethnic cleansing, so far as is relevant, Azerbaijan seeks declaratory relief. Such declaratory relief plainly can be ordered, and the conduct concerning landmines and booby traps is simply relevant evidence to the existence of the campaign. By contrast, Azerbaijan does not seek any relief with respect to demining or, of course, landmines or booby traps more generally. Mr. President, members of the Court, that concludes my remarks, and I thank you for your attention. May I ask you to call on Mr. Ochi, who will be making some short points on the presentation of facts that you heard on Wednesday.
I thank Mr. Wordsworth for his statement. I now invite Mr. Oge to take the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, members of the Court, it is common ground that at this stage the Court should assume that Armenia's armed forces planted mines and booby traps in civilian areas far from the line of contact. Mr. Salonidis continued to insist that all such explosives were set for defensive purposes only. His conclusion was this: landmines planted to obstruct the progress of the enemy and protect the retreat of armed forces cannot possibly amount to racial discrimination. And it was said that this was the only conclusion that can be reached based on the face of Azerbaijan's own evidence and objective facts. Considerable time was also spent comparing Azerbaijan's updated map of mines found with a series of further maps. The big point was that the mines were laid by Armenia's military forces as they withdrew from the formerly occupied territories. But all of this was to agree with a point that I made on Tuesday when introducing Azerbaijan's map. And just as on Monday, you heard not one word about Azerbaijan's detailed evidence of, for example, landmines placed in desecrated cemeteries or booby traps placed in civilian homes. There was no answer to my question of whether it was really being said that this could have been for defensive purposes only. And plainly, it would have been nonsensical to say that, for example, the only reason for hiding landmines under toppled Azerbaijani gravestones in a desecrated cemetery can have been to obstruct the progress of enemy advancing forces or to protect Armenian forces retreating in haste. Perhaps Mr. Salonidis was seeking to sidestep Azerbaijan's evidence by focusing on the locations where mines have exploded, what he referred to as the red dots on Azerbaijan's map on the screen, rather than where mines have been found. As regards the landmines and booby traps laid by Armenia's forces in civilian areas in the district of Kalbajar and Lachin, as well as Agdam, there is the further obvious difficulty that Armenia's forces did not retreat hastily as Azerbaijani soldiers advanced. Rather, Armenia's forces withdrew by agreement after the cessation of hostilities. Mr. Salonidis also suggested that what he called the sporadic dots to the left side of the map are remnants of the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. That was an invitation carefully to assess and weigh Azerbaijan's map of where mines have been found against Azerbaijan's earlier belief as to where mines might have been laid. And that weighing can, of course, be done at the merits stage only. Notably, Armenia has previously suggested to the court other explanations for the location of certain mines shown on this map. In January 2023, Armenia's council told the court that some of these mines were laid by within Armenia's territory, but between 2021 and 2022, they were dug up by Azerbaijani forces who then transported those mines into Karabakh. Further, by focusing on the top and the bottom of Azerbaijan's map only, Mr. Salanidis avoided the area in the middle, near Lachin city, now circled on the screen, including Azerbaijan's evidence of booby traps being set by Armenian forces long after the cessation of hostilities in the former homes of Azerbaijani civilians, which were deliberately destroyed, by way of example, in the villages of Sus and Zabuk during the agreed withdrawal of the Armenian forces in August 2022. Mr. Salanidis claimed that Azerbaijan's evidence was thoroughly addressed by Professor Murphy at the hearing of Azerbaijan's second request for provisional measures. But please note that the passages he referred to concerned only the alleged defensive purpose of certain landmines found in the smaller area now circled on the screen, which is not among the civilian areas that I highlighted on Tuesday. As to the sources of Azerbaijan's evidence, Mr. Salanidis could not suggest that ANAMA's findings are to be disregarded at this stage, nor could he dispute that ANAMA is a very well-respected agency supported by the United Nations Development Programme. However, it was implied that ANAMA's announcements after the scheduling of this hearing should be dismissed as self-serving. There is no basis whatsoever for that suggestion. And to note, the December 2020 United Nations report, to which both Mr. Salanidis and I referred, states, the assessment team found ANAMA to be an experienced and highly competent national mine action centre, well placed to manage, coordinate and execute mine action. Mr. Salanidis was also wrong to say that the November 2021 report of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation was, quote, prepared solely on the basis of Azerbaijan's allegations, end quote. That report states, the delegation received a comprehensive briefing at ANAMA and visited the vast tracts of land in the Agdam district heavily infested with lethal landmines. The apparent suggestion that this report should be disregarded merely because Armenia is not a member state of the OIC was perplexing. I turn to Armenia's refusal to hand over comprehensive and accurate information as to the placement of mines and booby traps after the cessation of hostilities. Mr. Salanidis stated that there are many possible justifications for this. He came up with just two. His first possible justification was that perhaps the information was simply not at Armenia's disposal, and it became available only later through so-called Nagorno-Karabakh military personnel. And it was said that Armenia's statement of the 25th of January of this year supports this. Thus, an attempt was made to distinguish between Armenia's forces and the so-called Nagorno-Karabakh armed forces. This is to ignore the established fact that armed forces of the illegally installed regime were highly integrated in Armenia's forces. It is also to ignore Armenia's own statement that it has only now resumed its survey. And Mr. Salanidis blanked the question of why on earth Armenia had ever stopped asking so-called NK military personnel for information which they were known to have. He also blanked the Armenian Prime Minister's admission in July 2021 that only a tiny part of the maps in Armenia's possession had been handed over. In this connection, it should be recalled, as should be obvious, that the United Nations report of December 2020 expressly stated, the urgency to gather, analyse and disseminate explosive ordnance-related data cannot be stressed enough. Information gathering is therefore by far the most important task for ANAMA at this stage, and UNAMA must direct its focus to this critical task. Armenia's second suggested justification was that maybe the landmines were used to defend the ethnic Armenian population and military positions in territory that continued to be held by the illegally installed regime. But that could not explain the refusal to share such information after the cessation of hostilities in September 2023. Indeed, when Armenia previously deployed this supposed justification at the December 2021 hearing, it emphasized that, quote, the military situation in the geographic area at issue remains active, end quote. Nor could it explain why, after the November 2020 trilateral statement, Armenia did not share maps of landmines and booby traps set in areas away from the zone where the Russian peacekeepers were temporarily deployed. And in this connection, Mr. Salonidis also ignored Armenia's statement to this court in October 2021 that, quote, we stand ready to provide any more maps in our possession regarding minefields behind the lines currently held by Azerbaijani armed forces, which now present solely humanitarian concerns. Mr. President, members of the court, there is plainly evidence that Armenia's forces planted landmines and booby traps with the purpose and effect of barring the return of Azerbaijani civilians. Armenia's preliminary objection asks that you either ignore or carefully weigh that evidence at this stage. The former is inconceivable, while the latter could only be for the merits. That concludes my submissions. I thank you for your attention, and may I ask you to call on Professor Boisson de Chazon.
I thank Mr. Ogi for his statement. Je donne maintenant la parole à...
Thank you very much. I would now give the floor to Ms. Laurence Boisson de Chazon. You have the floor, madam. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the Court, I shall address certain matters with a view to responding to erroneous assertions made by Armenia. This will once again show that Azerbaijan's claims regarding environmental destruction and degradation constitute environmental racism. In 2002, the Third Committee recognized that environmental racism is a form of discrimination covered by the Third. I must, however, make some preliminary remarks. First of all, as regards the jurisdiction of the court, Armenia recognizes that the test concerning the two elements that were set out, or the test that was set out by this court concerning the two elements in the Ukraine and Russia case is the test that must be met at the merits stage. However, the problem lies in the fact that counsel for Armenia then rushes to reinterpret the first paragraph of Article 1 of the Third by adding a third element to be met, that of differentiation of treatment of human beings. Aside from the artificial nature of that condition, it is interesting to note that Armenia did not invoke this additional condition last week in its allegations of detention and enforced disappearance. Furthermore, Armenia agrees that at this stage in the proceedings it must accept that it is the evidence presented by Azerbaijan in its written submissions that must be taken into account. And this evidence proves that the environmental destruction was indeed based on the ethnic or national origin of the Azerbaijanis and therefore is capable of falling within the scope of application of the Third. Finally, Armenia seems to admit that inferences based on the evidence can be made. Inferences are an essential component in legally establishing the facts. The question as to whether those inferences are correct or not is something which is to be examined at the stage of the merits. Now, please allow me to move on now to the first matter that I wish to address. Once again, Armenia has revisited the fact that ethnic Azerbaijanis did not live in the area where the environmental damage took place, and alleges that Azerbaijan declared that these persons did not intend to return to their homelands. Now, it is perplexing why Armenia continues to put this fallacious argument. Armenia's intention has always been to impede the return of the ethnic Azerbaijanis to their homeland. The Azerbaijanis, for their part, have always hoped and intended to return to their homes, as the agent for Azerbaijan told you. As Azerbaijan set out in its memorial, the brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing conducted by Armenia was so successful that the Azerbaijanis were not allowed, nor were they able to return to their homelands during the 30 years of occupation, and that despite several negotiations and international efforts. As part of its campaign of ethnic cleansing, perpetrated against ethnic Azerbaijanis, Armenia destroyed the natural environment of Azerbaijani districts by overexploiting and mismanaging natural resources. The fact that ethnic Azerbaijanis could not return home does not mean that they had not suffered discrimination or that their rights had not been violated, as Armenia once again has tried to claim. 3 comments must be made in this regard. Firstly, these people were not allowed to return home to the 7 districts because they were ethnic Azerbaijanis. Secondly, the rights had been violated, notably owing to the fact that the destruction and degradation of the natural environment of their territories constitutes a fundamental violation of their right to return. Thirdly, currently, their rights to access, use, and enjoy their property, their lands, and their resources are effectively violated, owing to the fact that these territories are now in an unsustainable and unsanitary state. Amongst the examples of Armenia's intention to destroy and degrade the natural environment of Azerbaijani territories, the OSCE mission reports, to which Azerbaijan referred in detail in its memorial, need to be raised here. The 2011 report noted that the 7 occupied territories of Azerbaijan around Nagorno-Karabakh are generally in ruins. Now, this situation explains why Azerbaijan is taking active measures to repair the environmental damage caused by Armenia and to render those territories inhabitable. Armenia made the point on Wednesday that Azerbaijan was constructing a motorway connecting Fuzuli and Shusha, but that has no connection whatsoever with the claims presented by Azerbaijan. After liberation of the occupied territories, Azerbaijan is obliged to connect its former territories, to make them accessible, and to restore them. Armenia has argued that none of the evidence presented by Azerbaijan shows that Armenia treated the 7 Azerbaijani districts differently to the areas inhabited by ethnic Armenians. And this in an attempt to refute that there was any targeted discriminatory conduct. That biased interpretation needs to be rectified. Azerbaijan's allegations of direct and indirect discriminatory impact on Azerbaijanis owing to environmental degradation and destruction requires a comparison to be made between the territories concerned. However, the court cannot undertake such an analysis at this stage. A comparative analysis is clearly an exercise that can only be conducted at the merits stage, when the two parties have presented their arguments and evidence. It is also important to note that Azerbaijan's allegation that Armenia degraded and destroyed the natural environment of Azerbaijan is based both on the objective and on the effect of Article 1 of the CERD. Armenia remained silent regarding the discriminatory impact on tree and forest cover in Azerbaijani territories. However, the experts of industrial economics identified a reduction of 8,899 hectares of tree and forest cover owing to logging, fires, to the development of hydropower, conversion of land usage, and mineral extraction. They reported that the Agdam district, which is populated by Azerbaijanis, had suffered the greatest reduction in forest and tree cover in terms of surface area, with a total of 3,353 hectares affected. Similarly, Fuzuli, another district populated by Azerbaijanis, had lost 56% of its total forest and tree cover. Now, this loss of forest and tree cover must be compared to that in the districts of Khojali, Khojevand, or Shusha, which are populated by Armenians. Allow me to underline once again the fact that in the districts inhabited by Armenians, the loss was only approximately 1%. Similarly, playing on rhetoric, Council for Armenia has argued that the hydroelectric plants are located along rivers. They simply follow the flow of the river. With Council putting the question, is Azerbaijan's case that these rivers flow in a discriminatory manner, or that the rain in Karabakh falls in a discriminatory way? This reasoning is absurd. Now, as you can see on the map on the screen, rivers also flow in Khojali, Khankendi, and Khojevand, three districts populated by Armenians, but there are no hydroelectric plants there. The plants have only been constructed in Kalbajar, Gubadli, and Lachin, three districts populated by ethnic Azerbaijanis and occupied by Armenia. As the experts noted, development of hydropower is one of the reasons for the disappearance of forests and plant cover in the occupied territories. There's another reason why Armenia built hydroelectric power plants in districts populated by ethnic Azerbaijanis. Let us take, for example, the district of Kalbajar. Now, as you see on the screen, the river that rises in Kalbajar flows eastwards, which means that, as the experts noted, it supplies fresh water to users beyond the occupied territories, in other words, to Azerbaijanis. But as you see on the map on the screen, approximately 15 hydroelectric power plants were built during the occupation to prevent access to and use and enjoyment of these water resources by Azerbaijanis. Mr. President, members of the court, is that treatment not discriminatory treatment? Armenia has also tried to simplify Azerbaijan's arguments to the extreme by suggesting that mines can only be built where the deposits are, and that it certainly cannot be argued that the mineral resources have been distributed in a discriminatory manner. Now, this is an attempt to obfuscate the issues of discrimination submitted to the court. Needless to say, the mines were built where there were mineral deposits. However, the crucial issue here is not the presence of mines, but that of their overexploitation and of illegal mining activities conducted by Armenia in the occupied territories, which have deprived the Azerbaijanis of their legitimate access to natural resources. The deposits of gold and other precious natural resources located in the occupied territories have been systematically looted by local Armenian companies. Furthermore, whether Armenia likes it or not, the UNEP report produced by independent experts notes that a significant expanse of mining and quarrying activities reportedly took place during the conflict period. Site visits indicate that mining development had had one of the largest physical impacts on the environment in the region. From what I have stated, Azerbaijan clearly is right to maintain that discriminatory acts of environmental destruction and degradation were committed by Armenia, and that they were based on the ethnic or national origin of the people concerned, given that Armenia's wrongful acts were deliberately concentrated in areas predominantly populated and inhabited by ethnic Azerbaijanis prior to their occupation by Armenia. Now, when it comes to the violation of the rights of ethnic Azerbaijanis, Armenia affirms in its memorial that Article 5 extends to all human rights and acts as a bridge to the broader international human rights canon to which it is organically linked. However, when it comes to the rights of ethnic Azerbaijanis, Armenia wants to promote a restrictive interpretation of Article 5. This restrictive approach and partial approach must be rejected. Irrespective, as regards the general recommendation 24 regarding the first article of the Convention, the Third Committee has indeed underlined that the Convention covers all the people who are part of different national or ethnic groups or native populations. And that is the interpretation which must prevail. International law accords displaced persons the right to return to their homes with dignity and in security, and the right to have the property stripped from them returned. Mr. President, members of the Court, how can that right be exercised when the homelands of the displaced peoples have been rendered uninhabitable by the degradation and destruction of the natural environment? What is more, as Azerbaijan has already stated, Armenia's unlawful conduct amounts to violations of Article 2, as well as violations of other human rights. These rights must be considered in combination and in light of the facts of this case. To conclude, the facts and legal arguments presented by Azerbaijan have demonstrated that the preliminary objection raised by Armenia regarding environmental destruction must be dismissed. Mr. President, members of the Court, thank you for your kind attention. Mr. President, may I invite you to call on Ambassador Rahman Mustafayev, co-agent of the Republic of Azerbaijan. I would thank Ms. Boisson de Chazoun for her oral statement.
Yeah.
Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the Court, it is an honor for me to appear before you again as co-agent on behalf of my country, the Republic of Azerbaijan, in order to present our final submissions. In light of the submissions you have heard this week, Azerbaijan is confident that the court will dismiss each of the preliminary objections presented by Armenia with respect to the court's jurisdiction and the admissibility of Azerbaijan's third complaint.
Toutes les formes de discrimination raciale. Mr. President, it was notable yesterday that Armenia's Council spent much time addressing you with detailed factual rebuttals relating to its placement of landmines and booby traps and its environmental destruction as part of its ethnic cleansing and cultural eradication campaign in the formerly occupied territories. Azerbaijan has identified some basic flaws in Armenia's factual narrative today, but will respond in detail at the merits phase. The same can be said of Armenia's self-serving and clearly incorrect assertion that its racist campaign was all over by 1994. As Azerbaijan has explained, Armenia's campaign continued relentlessly for almost another 2 decades until the final liberation of the occupied territories in 2023. Yesterday, the agent of Armenia labeled Azerbaijan's comments with regard to the racist ideology which underpinned Armenia's breaches of the third as, I quote, not the proper province of this phase. Such matters may cause Armenia discomfort, but they are absolutely relevant to this preliminary objections phase because they will assist the court's understanding of the singular nature and scope of Azerbaijan's third complaint, the material jurisdiction over which has been questioned by Armenia. Yesterday, remarkably, the agent of Armenia repeated its charade that Armenia was never the occupying power in Azerbaijan's sovereign territories. He quoted selectively from UN Security Council resolutions. He misrepresented ACHR jurisprudence. Council to Armenia faithfully followed suit, alluding to so-called Nagorno-Karabakh's armed forces, in an effort to convey that they were somehow separate from Armenian armed forces. All of this was a vain attempt to weigh the simple reality. In violation of international law, Armenia invaded, occupied, and ethnically cleansed Karabakh and the adjacent 7 districts over a period of nearly 30 years. Armenia's assertions are easily disproven with reference to Security Council resolutions 822 and 853 of 1993, which demanded the, I quote, withdrawal of all occupying forces from the Kelbajar and Agdam districts and other recently occupied areas of Azerbaijan. These are the same Kelbajar and Agdam districts of Azerbaijan from which Armenia finally and officially undertook to withdraw its troops 27 years later. I draw the court's attention to the trilateral statement of 10th November 2020, which ended the Second Karabakh War. This statement was made jointly by the President of the Russian Federation, the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, and the Prime Minister of the Republic of Armenia. The statement proclaims, I quote, a complete ceasefire and cessation of all military operations between 2 states, the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Republic of Armenia. Specifically, the trilateral statement proclaims that, I quote, the Agdam region shall be returned to Azerbaijan and, I quote, the Republic of Armenia shall return the Kelbajar region to the Republic of Azerbaijan by 15th November 2020 and the Latin region by 1st December 2020. The conclusions to be drawn are obvious. Armenia was, throughout the relevant period, the sole occupying power in then sovereign territories of Azerbaijan. The agent for Armenia refused to acknowledge a misleading statement made by Armenia's council on Monday. But her statement was clear, and I quote, "Discrimination against an ethnic group which was on its," that's Azerbaijan's, "own case, not located in the relevant territory and never intended to return there." Never intended to return. I will not explain again why it's simply inconceivable that Azerbaijanis never intended to return to their homes in the occupied areas, and why all parties knew that such returns would happen. Armenia's agent seemed to say that his counsel may have misspoken and intended to say that Armenia didn't intend Azerbaijanis to return. But even if that is the case, it's irrelevant. Whatever Armenia intended, the relevant issue is that it expected that Azerbaijanis would return, including to districts where they had previously constituted 99% of the population. Not only did Azerbaijanis intend to return, but this was always a fundamental precondition to any resolution of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And yet, Armenia intentionally pillaged those districts, rather than those where Armenians lived, with intention to frustrate the ability of Azerbaijanis to return. Armenia's agent made 3 additional assertions yesterday. First, he claims that, I quote, "Neither Armenia nor the local representatives in Nagorno-Karabakh ever prevented the United Nations from accessing Nagorno-Karabakh." As the court can see on the screen, in 2005, responding to a request of Azerbaijani side to send a fact-finding mission to occupied areas to verify the state of Azerbaijani cultural heritage, UNESCO explained that it had been prevented from accessing the territories occupied by Armenia. I quote, "However, the Secretariat has been prevented from sending a mission to verify the state of cultural property in the area, as other specialized agencies of the United Nations have not been able to enter these territories since the occupation by Armenian military forces." Again, in disregard of the clear documentary evidence, the agent of Armenia asserted that, I quote, "In reality, it was Azerbaijan that impeded UN access." But this is absurd. Members of the court, how could Azerbaijan have physically prevented the access to the territories that were at the time occupied militarily by Armenia? Second, Armenia's agent asserted twice that Azerbaijan, in his words, abandoned the Minsk group negotiations. Again, this was not correct. It's well known that in 2019, Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan proclaimed to the world that Karabakh is Armenia and that's it. It was that belligerent statement from the leadership of Armenia that brought the negotiations to a halt. Third, Armenia's agent asserted that the court denied Azerbaijan's preliminary measures request in 2021 based on Armenia's racial incitement through tweet accounts. As the court can see on the screen, the court unanimously ordered that the Republic of Armenia shall take all necessary measures to prevent the incitement and promotion of racial hatred, including by organizations and private persons in its territory, targeted at persons of Azerbaijani national or ethnic origin. Azerbaijan secured this order based on evidence of racial hatred emanating from Armenia, an element of which was the extensive use by Armenia of fake tweet accounts to stoke such hatred on both sides. Mr. President, members of the court, you have heard much over the past 2 weeks over hate speech. This included multiple misrepresentations by Armenia of the speeches of Azerbaijan's head of state, President Aliyev. Although these misrepresentations were systematically corrected by Azerbaijan's council, I want to close my remarks by reiterating that from the head of state down, Azerbaijan has consistently stated that it has never had any complaint with the minority ethnic Armenian population of Karabakh. An example of President Aliyev's statement is on the screen. You can see, as he said, if they want to live in Azerbaijan, as citizens of Azerbaijan, of course they can. To conclude, I would like to inform the court of some recent and most welcome developments in the relations between our two countries. For the first time since Armenia's 1991 invasion, Azerbaijan has recovered some remaining parts of its occupied sovereign territory without bloodshed. Last week, Armenia agreed to demarcate part of the land boundary and return to Azerbaijan 4 villages occupied since 1992. This development shows that genuine negotiations between the parties can result in meaningful and positive outcomes. Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, I thank you for your kind attention. I will now read out Azerbaijan's final submissions. The Republic of Azerbaijan requests that the court, A, dismiss each of the preliminary objections that Armenia sets forth in its final submission of 24th April 2024, on the ground that none of them is a valid objection to the court's jurisdiction or to the admissibility of Azerbaijan's claims, and B, in the alternative, dismiss each of those preliminary objections on the ground that each raises issues that should be deferred to the hearing on the merits.
To conclude, Mr. President, may I thank the Registrar and the Registry staff for their services before and during the proceedings. I would also like to thank the interpreters for their professionalism throughout this week. And of course, we once again thank all the members of the court for your kind attention. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the agent of Azerbaijan. The court takes note of the final submissions which you just read on behalf of your government. This brings the present series of sittings to an end. I would like to thank the agents, counsel, and advocates of the two parties for their statements. In accordance with the usual practice, I shall request both agents to remain at the court disposal to provide any additional information the court may require. With this proviso, I declare closed the oral proceedings in the case concerning application of the International Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, Azerbaijan versus Armenia, on the preliminary objections raised by the respondent. The court will now retire for deliberation. The agent of the parties will be advised in due course as to the date on which the court will deliver its judgment. Since the court has no other business before it today, the sitting is declared closed.